Minister, I'd like to address a couple of issues that are not central to the question of antisocial behaviour, but central to urban spaces, and not just Dublin, indeed, all urban spaces. There's wide issues here in how we develop our cities and the spaces that people live in. And the reality is, if you take, for example, Dublin 8 and walk through it at the moment, you'd barely recognise the Coombe, you'd barely recognise the Liberties, because the planners have had it their way. And all of the big developments that have taken place and that are smothering that area are built for tourism, for student accommodation, not for local people to live in, but for money to flow through that area. And that's precisely what I think is at the heart of the planners and those who think about Dublin and other cities and how they're going to progress them, about getting the money from tourism and foreign students who have plenty of money to pay for dear accommodation in and keeping them in and get them spending. There's another part of city life, and that is the people who live in the city, the children, the old people, the people who grew up in them. And they have absolutely very, very limited, if any, spaces in which to play, to participate in sports, to hang out together, to sit in parks and squares. And if they do have parks and squares, they're filthy, they don't have public toilets, they don't have proper seating. And I think when you disrespect a population like this, you in turn get the disrespect back in spades. But the one thing I want to focus on more than anything else is public transport. We're going through a period where we need very urgently to move to, I would argue, free, frequent public transport in order to deal with the climate catastrophe and the cost of living crisis. But what we're getting instead is a plan around bus connects, which I agree with. I agree with the improved services. I agree with getting more linked services across the city and nighttime 24/7 services, but they're being pushed through when there's a fierce staffing shortage. And so right across Dublin, and particularly in the south central area where they've just recently opened up 3 or 4 new spines, we are suffering from a mass shortage of public transport. And if we want people to feel safe in our city, particularly vulnerable people like people with disabilities, women indeed, elderly people, then providing them with a reliable, safe public transport system is absolutely crucial. How are they going to live and move around a city if they can't depend on that? And at the moment we can't. The 79 bus, for example, a famous route, there's been poetry and songs made about it, and goes through all the little estates in Ballyfermot, was recently taken out. And in its place they put in 2 spines, 2 G-spines that go right through Dublin West from Spencer Dock and out into practically into Kildare. That's great, and they're meant to run every 10 minutes and they're meant to run all night. That's all great, but it doesn't happen. And the alternative that was provided for the 70 bus, the so-called 60 route, hasn't showed up, and I've had questions answered from Dublin Bus as early as today, that at crucial times in the mornings when people are trying to get to school and work, and in the evenings when they're trying to get home, the service has failed, and it is getting worse all the time. Now, we had debates with Bus Connects about could they delay the introduction of the G-spine and the change around of the routes, and could they give more frequency to the estates in Ballyfermot? And they were told, no, we'll have to proceed, this plan is going ahead, despite acknowledging to us that there were 150 drivers short in the service. And then Go Ahead is equally, not as many, but it doesn't have as much of the service, but proportionately it is equally short of drivers. And then one asks why. Because they do good recruitment campaigns and they do recruit, but they can't retain the workers. And there are a whole plethora of reasons for this. The crucial one is the conditions that workers who drive buses face. One is the long and antisocial shifts that don't allow for a decent work-life balance. And the other is that they start on unequal pay. You have to be in the job at least 4 to 6 years before you begin to catch up with the senior drivers who do the same job and earn a different rate of pay. That has to end. The idea that we should adopt the neoliberal approach of attempting to privatise a vital public service by introducing competition that drives a race to the bottom, pushes down the pay and conditions of those who work in it, is leaving us short-staffed. And it is leaving us short-staffed in a serious way so that we cannot deliver a safe public transport system. And that is related to antisocial behaviour, and that is related to how people live in this city. So that ideology from how we conduct and live in our cities has to be removed. It's not all about money. It's also about a quality of life. It's about communities, and it's about people. And it is about those who work for us and deliver those services in our cities. So I believe, following on this debate, if we get the basics right, if we can provide decent public spaces with public toilets, with areas being cleaned up, if we can provide play areas, if we can provide places that are safe and inviting, and public transport that's safe and inviting, then we can deal with a lot of the problems that have given rise to this debate in the first place. And if we don't do that, then we are going to leave a lot of people behind in this city in terms of supporting whatever initiatives that in the future we may need to take to deal with the transport and the climate crisis.